Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, one of my aims with this show is to introduce you to ideas, stories and people that can help to inspire you to think differently about human risk. On this special episode, I'm going to introduce you to a fellow podcaster who produces content that I think you'll find interesting. Daniel Ross is the host of A Load of BS. No, that's not me being rude. It's the name of his show and newsletter. Like this podcast, A Load of BS interviews a wide range of people to try to get answers to the very simple question of why we do what we do and what can be done to influence that for good outcomes. I could just have pointed you to Daniel's show, but I thought I'd invite him into my virtual studio for a chat instead. Please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Ross on A Load of BS. Daniel, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
It is a great pleasure, Christian, to be here on a Monday morning. What better way to start the week?
It is a fabulous privilege for me to have you here. And look, to kickstart us off, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Oh, with great pleasure. I certainly will. Look, I started my career in the world of marketing communications, actually. I was working for a bunch of media agencies. I was planning advertising campaigns, working with big brands across Western Europe like Procter & Gamble, Vodafone. I then took a break. I went to business school to learn about business in theory. And since which time, that's the last sort of decade plus, I've been in financial services in various guises. So I worked for Barclays Bank in wealth management. Well, funnily enough, actually, there was even then a nascent behavioural science unit. Well, I'm not sure people really understood it all that well. But I was, subsequent to that, I gave up on that after a couple of years. Wasn't really my scene, bit too conservative and straitjacketed there. The last bastion of real ultimate financial services conservatism in wealth management, I think. And some interesting BS going on there as well, which we could come to, which I think is a little amusing. I was an early employee in an equity crowdfunding startup, so I started moving towards more entrepreneurial ventures. I was interested in fintech. This was about 2013, interesting time, certainly in the UK, to be involved in emerging financial technology ventures. More recently, I ran the innovation and corporate venture capital program for a large international portfolio of insurance and hospitality businesses owned by a South African family. And now, bringing it up to the present moment, I do a bunch of things, actually, but I advise corporations, often actually, again, in the insurance industry. And there's certainly, as we were just talking about, quite a lot of BS potential in insurance, which is quite interesting. But I advise corporations typically on innovation strategy. I run digital transformation programs. I'm working with insurtechs. I actually do a little angel investing on the side. And of course, then just sort of preempting where we might go with this, then there's A Load of BS, which is the podcast and accompanying newsletter which I publish, which has become an increasingly big part of my life in the last year. So I'm devoting plenty of time talking BS, excuse the endless childish humor there of the acronym, which of course gives me limitless pleasure, part of the fun. And really, as was at its heart, and we'll get onto this in more detail, I suspect, but with that, I'm really just trying to understand and explain why on earth we do the things that we do, and to do so by kind of telling real human stories. That's what's really important to me, actually. It's not about presenting sort of academic research and science for its own sake. I'm interested in getting under the skin of human behavior to share our quirks and peculiarities, to try and disentangle what on earth is driving us, how and why we make decisions, how we cope in a world of impossible uncertainty.
Wow, so much to unpick. But I want to sort of take you back and just go, what was your first sort of interest in behavioural science? Was there a point where you just suddenly went, this is a thing, or have you always been curious about people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, to say that, for many years, I'd had this urge to write. I had this urge to publish something. What was it going to be about? But I certainly felt that within the relatively tight confines of my corporate life, I sort of sought greater creative expression. And then, of course, one of the challenges for any new publisher, podcast maker, writer is, finding one's voice. What's the real value one has to add on any particular subject? And actually, funnily enough, I wrote this blog piece on this sort of subject last Christmas, which was titled 2021, My Year of Total BS, in which I was describing trying to describe the process of finding one's niche, one's authentic voice, and all the sort of experimentation, iteration, sense of play, actually, which is required to find this point of unself-conscious production. in terms of the BS subject matter itself, it was a subject that I'd always had a great interest in. I'd followed it. I'd read a lot of the sort of predominant literature. But it's actually going beyond that. It's really because my broader interests, I think, have always leaned towards stories in which human behavior, in all its oddity, in all its complexity, has been very, very front and center. So I think about the authors, the comedians, the filmmakers they all incorporate some of life's great eccentricity. And so actually, I started the process doing interviews which were much broader in scope than BS. And then I actually then sort of zeroed in. And actually, for me, despite a lot of the sort of serious application of it and the consequences of it, much of the time for me, what I love about it, it's just really fun, is it not? Finding out about the less obvious, unusual, at times crazy behaviors that people have. I mean, just if I think about just going back to sort of the writers, the filmmakers, comedians, I think, the writers like Graham Greene, Somerset Maugham, Karl Ove Knausgaard, Woody Allen, Larry David, P.G. Wodehouse, William Boyd. I mean, all to greater or lesser extents are telling real human stories. And in contrast to that, I've always had very little interest in, as I sort of science fiction as a contrast. What's always interested me is kind of is close observation, I guess.
So many things to pick up there. I mean, the first one that really struck me was when you were talking about finding your voice and creativity. And what I think is really interesting is when we think about corporate environments, there are so many constraints on people. And so on the one hand, this plays into my whole sort of human risk and then the flip side being human reward, right? Which is so people pose a risk, but also we want to get the best out of them. There's a reason that we hire people. And in the 21st century, I find it fascinating because we hire people to do things that the machines can't. Because if the machine could do it, it would be much better to give it to the machine. So that is things like nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, empathy, all those sorts of things. And the bit I find fascinating is the way you were talking. I just had visions of you sitting there with like a PowerPoint template or a memo that is intentionally designed to constrain messaging in a particular format that they want it in. And I can understand the logic for that, which is you need control. We don't want people going rogue. We don't want but actually, if we're hiring people, I totally understand your frustration. Sort of sitting there, this PowerPoint template, as an example, doesn't let me do what I want to do, right? I have to put it in these formats, use these fonts. And there's a logic to that, but it's also, I think, hugely restrictive. So I love this idea of lots of people, and I was definitely one of them, who's sitting in corporate machines where they're the very things in a way that they've been hired to do are being constrained in many cases by understandable and yet from a getting the best out of people, massively limiting factors. And so this vision of you going, I need to find my voice, I think is really interesting. And I hope resonates with quite a few people sitting in that environment because, as I say, it's understandable why companies do that, but I think it's missing a massive trick nowadays.
Well, I fully agree. And of course, much of corporate life is about creating borders, parameters, and constraints. And it brings up the question, of course, of creativity and frankly, our obsession with machines, with AI, with computer intelligence. And of course, there's a balance. There's value in process, and there's value in creating a sort of a sense of control. There was an interesting article in Wired that I read just this morning, brushing my teeth, which was this kind of a love note, if you like, to kind of harking back to a time of greater creativity and accepting all our foibles, our weaknesses, and our irrationalities for what they are, and to take advantage of that more, and to kind of pull back a little on our obsession to automate and to and to control everything. I think there's sort of great risk in that. Of course, it's clear that AI has its benefits in terms of what it can automate. But as you touch on, it doesn't understand nuance, it doesn't understand context, and it doesn't understand psychology. And that's why, of course, the hybrid model is important, and particularly in a world where AI models are increasingly hungry for data. And of course, data is a risky thing. Data is not always accurate, and the more we search for it, the more we want it in greater volume. I think the greater risks there are in feeding garbage in and getting garbage out. So I think there's this balance. But certainly for me, if I think about myself in terms of the work environments that I thrive in, or sort of tried to thrive in when I was younger, certainly working in towers in Canary Wharf was not for me. Funnily enough, just a quick little story. I remember when I first started at Barclays, and there was a health and safety briefing on the sort of 77th floor or whatever it was of Canary Wharf Tower Z. And the person leading the session said, of course, the great thing about this building is, as you'll notice as you go up and down the flights, is that every floor looks exactly the same. And that was supposed to be an advantage. And I remember my heart sinking, thinking, what on earth am I doing here? Because that sort of sense of monotony already was eating me up inside.
I love that, right? This is amazing. Every single floor is identical, right? Well, that's not helpful from a navigational perspective.
Well, it's not. If you've ever worked in a bank, of course, you'll know that you have those circular floors where you have the photocopier, the kitchenette, the toilet, the arsehole boss in his glass-fronted cabinet.
The bit I found funny was the only reason you'd know you were on the wrong floor in many cases because your security pass didn't work. There was no.
Right, you've been there. You know all this exactly. Yeah.
Right. So I love that idea of kind of bringing out finding your voice and sort of just exploring things, and then this idea of literature being about people. I mean, I did a literature degree, and I've realised that for me that was a proxy for behavioural science. I think ultimately, had there been behavioural science available, I probably would have gone down that route. And I realised that, to your point, we tend not to write books, or at least not sort of fiction about inanimate objects. It gets a bit dull. We don't, we tend to write it about humans, why they do things, and it's all exploration. What's going on here, and how will this finish, and what do these people, and why did they do that? Why did they not do that? That drives our interest in fiction. So I think this is a really interesting point. For me, a lot of the time that I look at behavioral science, you're right, it's making sense of the world that's around us. And so what attracts me to drama, for example, is things I will recognize. And so I'm with you. I find stuff that's too far. I can accept things that are set in different worlds that I can recognize because of that human component. But put me in an environment where it gets a bit too weird and I don't have that hook in on something I recognize, it gets a bit more difficult. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think we can learn a lot from kind of literary studies and escaping that, which doesn't necessarily sit nicely with the sort of science of.
Well, exactly. I mean, funnily enough, someone we both know quite well, Paul Craven, I mean, his definition of behavioral science is one that I always go back to because I struggle to find ones which are pithier or more succinct. And he says, what is it all about? It's about how real people make real decisions in the real world. And so then what does that mean for me? And I'm by no means the first person to say this, but I want to also deconstruct, the traditional economic models and theories, which are all about, optimization, opportunity cost assessment, trust, cooperation, market supply, demand, all this stuff, by the way, which was drummed into me during economics classes at business school, and which, of course, don't at all really explain how much of the real world works, how we behave, and generally how we just muddle through and cope in this world of terrible uncertainty. One thing that just occurs to me when I think about uncertainty, talked about this in my podcast actually with another of our mutual friends, Gerald Ashley, who talks about our human desire to model everything, to assign risk probabilities to everything. Like, I think there's one strand which I could pick up, which comes up in almost all my conversations. It's somehow coping with this the question of certainty, or rather lack of certainty, total uncertainty, randomness in our everyday lives. And there's something about behavioral science which is trying to give us the tools to cope and manage in a world of uncertainty, in a world in which we are ever increasingly anxious and unsure about how things work. I mean, you can take that into all spheres. I had a conversation on my pod with Jeff Kreisler last week. Jeff is the global MD of BS. There's a good job title for you. At JP Morgan Chase. He wrote Small Change Money Mishaps and How to Avoid Them with Dan Ariely, which is all about how you spend, save, and invest money, and all the kind of flawed emotional decision making which goes around that. I've had conversations with a ritual expert. That's fascinating, by the way. Why do we conduct rituals, from the low intensity repetitive ones to the extreme painful ones? But between those extremes, there's something very common there, which is about somehow coping in an uncertain world. I find that a very fascinating idea. And
I really like that, because we all crave this certainty. So we like, that classic example of why do we have indicator boards at bus stops and for train stations? Well, it's so that you know when the train is coming. It reassures you you're in the right place. It's providing certainty in a world where if we don't have that, we start to kind of create our own narratives and we worry about things and we want to know. And so we recognize that as a human dynamic. And yet many of the constructs around which society is built have a degree of certainty to them, or purport to have a degree of certainty, which just we know is unrealistic. And so whether you look at advertising, and we kind of know that things we're being told, they can't lie, but on the other hand, there are these misrepresentations. Things look more perfect than they actually are. People look more perfect than they actually are. We have rules and regulations that are sort of designed to codify, to make it simple to know how to behave. And yet there are going to be circumstances under which those rules make no sense whatsoever. We'll have bureaucrats requiring things that are idiotic because that's what the rules say. And so I really like that tension between our desire for the certainty, but also our recognition that things are always a bit more complicated. And actually, the more we cleave certainty, the less opportunity for serendipity, but also the less realistic it is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not sure also whether a lot of our kind of coping mechanisms, the degree to which they're conscious or unconscious, I'm not sure how able most people would be able to somehow articulate this sort of sense of uncertainty in what they're actually doing. Let's go back to money. Why is it? How do we value things? Why are people spending in such a way? Why is it that people spend £3 on a latte and then at the same time compare grocery prices to save 10 people? Why are people doing all this thing? I'm not sure that they necessarily tie it back to any great logic, apart from that we're all flawed, emotional, odd creatures.
So your curiosity in this space led you to go with the podcast, and I'm guessing a little bit like mine. I kind of went through I will have a podcast. And I'd always wanted to be in radio. And I kind of worked out what it was as I was doing it, and where I would go and who I would want to invite. And you learn as you go. And so what was your thinking when you started, and how has that evolved in terms of the format and the guests that you have?
I mean, I've always wanted to keep it very broad. So if I go back to the objectives of the pod, well, look, it's about education. It's about entertainment. It's about building a community. It's about having engagement. And as I said earlier, I'm not interested in just sort of presenting academia for its own sake. If you look at my guests, you'll see a huge range of different types of guests. Some who obviously come from the kind of great canon of BS writing, but there are also plenty of people who have no professional BS qualifications, but nevertheless have something profound and interesting and unique to say about the human condition. So I've always been interested in breadth. I mean, for example, I'm talking to Martin Sorrell later this week. I'm talking to Rory Bremner, political satirist. I'm going to be talking to Martin about negotiation and influence and the art of doing the deal. So I think, there's always something, with not with everyone, but I'm looking for something which is doing something a little less usual, getting under the fabric and under the skin of personal motivation, of influence, of what actually kind of drove these people to do and achieve what they did. So if you look at the kind of the backgrounds of the people that I've talked to, they go from politics, sport, evolutionary biology, finance, advertising, wine and alcohol, parenthood, mental well-being. And I'm deliberately broad in that because I want to open the subject up as much as I can. And I'm conscious, by the way, that at times I'm stretching a point a bit, but look, we're always talking some BS somewhere or other. I mean, actually, one of the fascinating ones that I did, just popped into my mind, I had a conversation with Times journalist David Aronovich about conspiracy theories. I mean, David is by no means a BS expert, but of course, the behavioural science around conspiracy theories is fascinating. Who are the types of people who start and promote conspiracy theories, and what is it about conspiracy theories that is so attractive? All those sorts of questions get to the heart, I think, of understanding why we behave the way we do.
I love the fact that it's let's pour some people some interesting things to say who aren't necessarily qualified in the field. And it's something I've done. I've had a few people that I've approached who I think would be brilliant, who've gone, I don't feel qualified to come on. And it's almost actually, in many cases, the people that sort of say, well, I haven't really got anything to say on that, who probably have I mean, not everybody, clearly there are some people that have limited, but some of the people have sort of felt a little bit, they've gone, I'll stay in my lane. And I'm like, no, your lane is, because actually what you're going to talk about, your experiences, I'm not necessarily expecting you to be able to decode them all. Part of the joy is you come and talk about what you've done, and we can together work out, well, what do we think is going on here, and how might that inform people? And so for me, I love that sort of freewheeling approach that you have, which chimes very much with what I do here, which is almost, we start point, nothing is off limits. And we work out, clearly it has to have some sort of resonance to the show. And I think your point around it's got to be interesting.
There is sometimes an inverse relationship between how sort of superficially prepared and polished someone may be and how interesting they are. I say that obviously with some great interest, because what I'm indicating here, of course, is that my lack of polish obviously means that I'm far more interesting than extraordinarily interesting because I'm extremely ill prepared. No, but I mean, for example, I've been doing a bit of a mini series on psychology of sport, which is a personal interest. So I've interviewed Gary Lineker, who, for those who don't know, is a very well-known ex-professional international football star of great reputation and achievement, who's now one of BBC's top-paid sports presenters on Match of the Day, which is sort of Britain's most popular football highlights show. And, he is not a psychologist, but isn't it fascinating to talk to someone who's taken a penalty in the heat of a World Cup semi-final against the Germans, and just to talk to that person and say, what does it feel like? What's going through your mind? And to ask questions around, what does it take to be a successful athlete at the very top level for a long period of time? How do you understand the need to be selfish against the team, against the necessity for kind of team balance and the collective? How do you think about questions of ritual and superstition? What makes successful team dynamic? All those sorts of questions. I did another one with another football broadcaster called Guillem Balaguer, who specializes in Spanish football. For those who follow European football will be familiar with Guillem, but Guillem has also written a number of really interesting biographies of some of the great icons of football, like Pep Guardiola and Diego Maradona, his most recent book, and ask questions around, what has made these guys icons of football in their very different ways? How do they create auras around themselves? How is it and why is it that they became successful in their different ways? What drives them? And why is it that they are both in their own way so fragile and vulnerable at the same time? I find all that sort of stuff fascinating. And by the way, rather cynically, if you go onto Spotify or Apple or any other platform, there are bucket loads of interviews with all the usual characters. I don't think there are that many interviewing footballers or journalists about the subject. So I sort of like the idea of taking the less trodden path, if you like, and seeing if I can eke out a BS angle.
And you do, right, very successfully, because I think it's that for me, this is all about asking questions that let people talk. And one of the things I love about your format, and I think plays into is sort of, I couldn't predict necessarily exactly what questions you're going to ask on a show. And that's the joy of it, because I come and listen, and I sort of think, actually, you're going to take the conversation in a direction that I wouldn't necessarily have taken it in. And that's not to say that yours is better than mine. It's just interesting, right? And it's a different perspective on things. And I love coming away from it and sort of going, that's an interesting angle. Because I think, one of the things that's fascinating about it is sort of, as we try and unpick what drives our behavior, there's the usual thing about, why am I actually doing this? Why do I think I'm actually doing this? And what do other people think that I'm doing? And so we have these different lenses. And for me, the kinds of discussions with people unpicking things they've been through, sort of providing them with a secondary lens through which to look at it, I think is fascinating, and I think is a really useful way of us thinking not just about what they've done, but also our own experiences and the fact that not everything is as it seems.
Yeah, the question again, I'm just sort of thinking as you're talking about the sorts of subject matter. The conversation I had with Dimitris Sigalatas, which I'm going to be publishing this week, all being well, which is on the subject of rituals. Of course, rituals is something that is common to all of us because we all celebrate our birthdays. A lot of us go to sports games and experience the very arousing collective rituals that going to sports games entail. It's sort of interesting when you think about the really extreme rituals, which sometimes it can be sort of rather entertaining and perverse, although one has to be careful not to sort of trivialize these things, because for many people, they're very serious things. But to try, I suppose, and make a connection about what is it that I have in common as someone who has no interest in sticking metal rods through my cheeks or doing any other kind of body piercing and attaching weight to it and dragging it around town and enduring that kind of level of annual suffering. So it's almost take that extreme, and then what is the point of commonality there with someone like myself sitting in northwest London, who once had a body piercing but put an earring through his ear, age 16, and had it yanked out by his father. That's about as much of an extreme ritual that I have ever experienced. But it's not only interesting going to the extremes of society to hear how people. For example, I did riffing in left and right here, but did a really fascinating podcast on evolutionary taboos with Dr. Jesse Bering at the University of Otago in New Zealand, who is a sort of experimental psychologist with a specialism in these sorts of taboos, fetishes, perversions, suicide, afterlife, all these sorts of areas which are rather difficult to talk about, which often cross this sort of grey boundary between normality and morality. Very interesting debate. So on the question then of taboos, you start having a bit of a laugh because you're sort of talking about these people called the climacophiliacs, if I'm pronouncing this, and these are people who can only have orgasm by tumbling down a flight of stairs. And of course it does pose fascinating questions about the logistics.
How would you find that out in the first place? Is the bit I want.
Well, exactly. I mean, you start the white paper as you at the bottom of the stack. I'm not quite sure how you report it. Apparently, I think it's very, very niche, as you might imagine. I think it's only one man in Pakistan who has sort of reported it. I don't know if it's self-reported or whether, and all sorts of questions around how it gets reported, but more obviously, perhaps, how on earth it actually happens. Maybe that's we mustn't digress too much. But of course, it's very easy to start sort of trivializing and sort of laughing at these things. But of course, it's also bloody fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we're so diverse and odd that it certainly makes all sorts. And I mentioned all the body piercing. I was referring to it's a particular festival carried out by the Tamils in different countries in the world, and where Dimitris has researched it is in Mauritius. No bad place to carry out research with a group called it's called the Taipusim Kavadi Festival. I mean, it's quite unbelievable what they go through. But what's fascinating is the sense of belonging and community and social interaction that it engenders. It's also, of course, interesting that from a layman's point of view, if you ask someone why on earth you actually carry out a ritual, there's very little analysis to it, which always makes one sort of hold back from overimposing sort of scientific layers on top of things. If you ask most people why they do things, it's just because I do and because my father did and his father did. And there's something kind of strong in the repetition and tradition and family connection that it provides.
And it's almost the stuff that we can least justify that has the strongest connection. So whether that's support for a football team or religion, it's just there. And I think that's a really good example of something where what I guess you and I are both trying to do is to sort of unpick these things and go, well, what can we learn from that? And sure, we're not participating. You don't have to be a football fan to recognize that it has a hold on people. You don't have to be religious to recognize that. We can all recognize those dynamics going on. And I think it's fascinating just to sort of go, well, let's just stop a second. And it's almost like, as you're talking about these things, it's almost like freeze framing going, let's just take a look at what's happening here. And without wishing to give either of us the status of a David Attenborough, there is a little bit of that, which is just let's just explore some stuff and see what can come out. And I think for me, what's really interesting is that we're allowed to do this. We don't have the academic rigor behind the questions that we're asking, and we're not conducting experiments, but we're just probing a little bit to see what we can learn. And that seems to produce some interesting insights.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think we're touching on areas of things which cannot be explained. So whether it's religion, superstition, cults, conspiracies, all sorts of different rituals and taboos, these are often things which lie in our self-conscious, which are of course accentuated by societal norms and those around us who bring them out of us. And of course, again, go back to this issue which we talked about at the beginning, which is about their coping strategies as well. Okay, it's about imposing some sense of control in a world of craziness. And if your sense of control is about a ritual which you do year after year, then it is creating some kind of framework in what is otherwise a rather random, anxiety-ridden existence. And so, that's why do people carry out or follow conspiracy theories? Because in some ways, they allow you to hold a narrative which other people cannot really deny, because in a sense they're rubbish, they're nonsense. And also, of course, we live in a world of increased disinformation, so you can sort of say what you like anyway. And of course, so much of our discourse anyway is extremely polarized. You can say any sorts of thing and you can promote it and you can find supporters of that. But of course, conspiracy theories tend to be rather more thrilling, exciting and attractive than the real world. And so it's all about kind of finding the narrative that suits you. Religion similarly, or go back to superstition. and sport. I mean, there's a kind of a fine line, I think, between what is a superstition, what is a cult, what is a conspiracy, and so on. But if you talked again to Gary Lineker about superstitions, he had one where if he was on a positive scoring spree, I think it was one, either he would or wouldn't. I think it was that he wouldn't then cut his hair.
You better get that
So
right, right? It's one of those ones where
I know, but
you don't need to remember it, but he did, right?
Yeah, he needed to remember it. God, do I need to get the scissors out or not? What the hell's going on? There are panic stations. Cricketers are notoriously superstitious. You don't move if a batsman is on 99 on the balcony, or if you're trying to save the game, or you're not allowed to go to the loo, or you only you put on your left pad before your right pad. But of course, by the way, there's something interesting here, which is it's not just sort of Looney Tunes. I mean, there is something called, the expectation effect, which is that, you can create, it's almost like sort of placebo effect outcomes. You can engineer the experience with the right level of anticipation and with the right level of preparation, in the same way that, if you go to a good restaurant and you'll be given a bottle of wine by a sommelier who describes the wine, recommends the wine, opens it, pours it, swells it around and puts his nose in it for you, that wine's going to just taste better than if you pour it into a mug and sip it in front of the TV at home. So you're sort of creating expectations. You are engineering the outcome, and the mind is very flexible in that way.
As you talk around these things, one thing that struck me, which I do want to mention, is they talk about rituals and sort of looking for, we look for things to sort of mark actually what would otherwise be a pretty dull existence if we didn't have these things. And it struck me, I don't know what made me think of it, but that song, I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day. Bad analysis, right? Terrible analysis, because if it was, it wouldn't be interesting or exciting. And I think there's lots of things there where we, the power of some of these things isn't necessarily recognized until we stop and look and say to ourselves, actually, what is going on here? Oh, that's working quite well. And one of the things I found, I'm sure you've got this, is you start to spend your life wandering around with a pair of glasses on or lenses on, where you're looking for the stuff all the time. And I feel a little bit like, apologies to people who haven't seen the movie, The Kid in the Sixth Sense, in that I'm spotting stuff everywhere. Now, I'm sure I'm spotting stuff that isn't there, but I'm also just going, oh, that's really interesting the way they did that. And I keep getting into trouble. Like, I'll take pictures in supermarkets of something, display or a sign, and people kind of go, what are you doing? Why are you taking pictures? Because it looks immediate. But there is this, it's very exciting. It's also quite debilitating to be wandering around the whole time, analyzing what's going on and thinking about, well, how is this playing? What is this doing to me? And sometimes, I don't know about you, but I struggle sometimes to switch it off.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of that, actually. I mean, it's a bit sort of bizarre. My sister-in-law is actually selling her flat, and we were having a WhatsApp conversation. She was asking, should I remove more of my personal photographs of, before I have viewings? And of course, I started going into BS mode, saying, well, of course, definitively you shouldn't, because lived-in properties allow the viewer to fantasize about living there. Of course, it requires far more effort and imagination to transport yourself with. I mean, that's sort of fairly intuitive, but of course, then we start going on to the question of, if the fantasy of a lived-in property encourages the sense of virtual ownership, attachment to products that we feel without buying them completely. Of course, it's dangerous if you're a buyer. Wonderful if you're the seller. And all this kind of thing. So we do start going down rather slippery slopes. There's something you said which about rituals, and it's something about punctuating our year with novelty, whether that's going on holiday or celebrating our birthday. And of course, if you do them too frequently, they lose their novelty value. But it goes back to a debate about the sort of the balance in one's life between being sort of very rational about how one spends one's time and one's money versus sort of indulgence and splurging as well. I feel that there was a sort of parallel there, which is something that I've thought about, because if you read sort of Jeff and Dan Ariely's book about money and how you spend it, of course a lot of it is about recognizing that we're flawed emotional characters, and that there's no point trying to sort of fundamentally change human beings, because that's what evolution does more slowly, but that it's about creating awareness for our unconscious decision making biases, and giving kind of tips and tactics about how to be a little more organized. But at the same time, it's there should be occasions in life, hopefully within most people's means, where a bit of indulgence, where a bit of irrationality, where buying that £100 or £50 bottle of wine ahead of the £8 bottle of wine is just bloody fun for the hell of it. And you don't have to be a satisficer all your life. Sometimes you can just splurge and be a maximizer and know and enjoy that you're wasting money, but there's just a sort of a pleasure in the experience of it. And of course, by the way, the way that you create an experience has a huge impact on terms of the outcome of it. The very act of overindulging or buying an expensive bottle of wine, despite that there's very little return on most wine beyond about 30 quid, just sets you up for an enjoyable experience. And, you're just going to enjoy it that bit more.
And I love this idea of indulging the irrational, because I think as we look at lots of things that we've clocked over COVID and more generally, things that are efficient, things that are sensible, are often actually vulnerable. They are dull. They don't get the best out of us. So when I look at my world, I kind of think natural tendency is let's let the accountants loose on things, get things for the lowest possible price. Let's do things that are let's not waste a moment. Let's do it as quickly as possible. And yet, actually, a lot of the things that have gone wrong and that we've seen under COVID week, just-in-time supply chains fail very, very easily when something can't get there just in time, because it's all predicated on that working out. Equally, having a little bit of time doing nothing, going for a walk. I mean, if you said that, and I love it, banking is a really good example. If you went, I'm going to go and walking might just about now be acceptable with a little bit of mental health angle, but they'd be thinking about, okay, we'll give him get some fresh air. And people think he's off to have a cigarette or something. There'll be some kind of cover story for it. But I think there's a lot to be said for just exploring things. And what I think is fascinating about the way you talk about the subject and the way I do is that in doing our research, you will watch random things, read random books, think about stuff, get sucked into Wikipedia rabbit holes. And that can sometimes be a massive waste of time, right? No question about it. And I've spent hours looking at stuff that's gone nowhere, or at least I don't consciously think has gone somewhere. I'd like to believe that it's somehow added to the sum total of my life. But there's other things where you just randomly wander off a little bit, sort of trying. And I like to think of it as sort of Heston Blumenthal, who's this for people that don't know, is this amazing chef who's closer to a scientist than a chef, who does crazy things with dishes and has this incredible restaurant. For me, that's quite joyous. I mean, it's really frustrating when nothing comes, but you can get some incredible things just by doing things that you shouldn't do. The counter, this is sort of Rory Sutherland territory. Do the counterintuitive stuff. Try the things that might seem like a complete waste of time and see what happens. And I think there's a joy when you explore behavioral science, because suddenly you can, this is dangerous, right? But you can justify why one might do that.
Yeah, I think, look, we definitely live in a world of sort of fetishizing productivity and, being kind of super organized and managing one's time. Of course, one of the things that people have said is the great benefit of lockdown is that we've translated the 1 hour meeting into a half-hour meeting on Zoom, or whichever platform you use. There's some sort of truth in that. But on the other hand, of course, you end up filling your day with endless meetings. One of the things, talking about personal motivation, about what I'm doing, I think what we're both trying to do is standing back from the conversations I have, is allowing all that to sort of percolate, allowing myself some more introspection, allowing myself to question myself, to gain greater understanding about our existence, to learn. So I'm trying to avoid sounding pompous and pretentious with this, but I mean it in a very kind of low caps way, but to try and sort of learn, I suppose, how to lead a richer, calmer, more collaborative life. And by the way, your point about taking time out, whether it's to sort of smoke a cigarette, or go for a walk, or whatever it is that you want to break the routine with, if you look back at all the great people, achievers, characters of the last 100 plus years, at least in sort of modern memory, whether it's Churchill to great writers and the people, Crick and Newton, who discovered DNA. My memory's not serving. But anyway, whether it's poets, scientists, military leaders, they all broke up their day between rest and had rest and play throughout their day. In fact, I think Churchill had a big rest in the afternoon, probably had a bottle of champagne and a cigar, and then started his second working day at about 5 or 6 p.m. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, but we are sort of obsessed and compartmentalize them in a very sort of strict 9 to 5. There's no great benefit to that. We fetishize busyness, right? If someone says, "How are you?" you have to sort of say busy. Part of that is just a social tick. How are you? I'm fine. I mean, no one's going to say, "Look, unless you're dying, don't ask me," or don't expect to. But I think there's an enormous amount to be said for, let's say, certainly allowing the last couple of years to engender greater flexibility and reflection in the way we lead our lives.
The other thing I think is interesting as we look at the book of work, if you like, or the people that you've interviewed and the people I've interviewed, is that we often we like to think that the circumstances we're in, it's very unique. And I go and work with clients and I get sort of, we have a very unique business model. And of course they're right? I don't want to, they do, there are unique features, but there are so many things that have a sort of cross-human relevance. And so, my favorite one on my show is I interviewed a sexologist to talk about she was fascinated about mask wearing and what you could learn from getting people to wear condoms. I'll put a link to this episode in the show notes, as with all the episodes, all the things we talk about in there.
Great.
But she was talking, there was a linkage between how do we get people to wear masks and how do people get people to wear condoms for HIV. And so it was just a fascinating conversation with her because she'd intuitively understood some things that were relevant in a completely different context. And as I listened to some of the things, it struck me that what we're both trying to do is going a stage further than what often happens, which is, companies sort of go, right, we need to get someone in on leadership. Let's get some sports person in. And very often it's stroking the egos of the senior person. They're a fan of X, so let's get their hero in so they can meet them and have a photograph and get the shirt signed, all that stuff. But you hear these speeches of sort of, sportsmen talking about leadership. And it's fine as far as it goes, but it's not particularly actionable. And what I think is really interesting here is that we're going a little bit further than that. And we're saying, yes, actually, there are some insights to be had here. But let's not pretend that the office is a battlefield or a sports ground. It's not about that. It's about the micro-human decision-making and the influences on that decision-making that we can learn from. And I think this sort of takes something from context A and deploy it in context B is massively underestimated precisely because we have lots of reasons why we don't think that's a good idea. And so as you're unpicking these stories, there's something that will resonate for people, I think, in their day-to-day existence, even if to your point, even if you've never experienced it for yourself.
No, I think that's so true. I mean, I'm just trying to think of specific examples, but the principle of crossover learning, transferable ideas, that sort of cross-fertilization, if you like, of taking one thing from one domain and crossing it into another. I mean, that's real creativity. And the more interviews I do, the more fields I cover, whether it's talking about, finance and banking, to motherhood, to rituals, to conspiracy theories, to advertising, or to booze. I'm learning all the time, and you start to sort of see all this crossover, and of course these sort of commonalities again of at heart, one's witnessing the same sorts of concerns, coping mechanisms, nudges. Time and again. So you're absolutely right.
Talk about the podcast. Just talk a little bit about the newsletter, which goes with it, and obviously tells people that. But it's a little bit more than sort of notification of another episode.
No, that's right. I mean, by the way, my pods and newsletter are constant works in progress, so I am absolutely open to all feedback and ideas about how to do it better. I mean, I was just spending yesterday riffing on how I play around with the formats and create greater engagement. And actually, a couple of friends were saying to me, "Well, the newsletter is rather too long." And I said, "Well, sometimes there's value in long form." But I also
that's funny because I think that's strange because I think. I've had lots of people say that. And if I take social media posts as an example, I get much more engagement from longer posts that shouldn't work. And I think there's something. So I think that that's a really interesting example. Of course, they have their views. And of course, that's what they think. And there will be people for whom they're long. On the other hand, there is potentially some value in not going with the classic logic of everything needs to be short, snappy.
Yeah. I know. It's so frustrating.
And so you can't make something that will please everybody. But I do think that's really interesting because whenever I ask people, one, you get that there's a difference between, actual sort of, I can't remember I always get these phrases wrong, but sort of describe behavior and actual behavior. And then the second thing is actually sometimes it's a Henry Ford thing, right? If you all just give people what they think they want, you're never going to break out. You wouldn't have the iPhone, for example, because it didn't have a keyboard. And so I think there's something really interesting as you go through that creative process of saying, on the one hand, I do need to listen to what my audience is telling me, because if I go completely batshit the other way, I'm not going to get. On the other hand, if I don't push the limits, I'll never know. And that for me is the challenge. I don't know if you have that sort of challenge, but I always look at it and sort of think, I need to listen, but also sometimes not listen.
Yeah, I'm tempted by maybe there's some reverse psychology. I should just like start every email saying, "You don't know what you want. I don't want to hear from you. Suck it up, or bugger off," in a rather sort of obtuse alternative marketing strategy, which kind of takes something of the Steve Jobs worldview and a more kind of old, command and control. But I think, by the way, there's maybe interesting correlation between those who sort of hark against the long form, therefore probably obsessed with sort of short-term gratification, because in the sort of bite-sized content world, and those who actually probably who don't put money away for retirement. Of course, there is this interesting piece of BS about, programs to help people save for retirement properly. And, the problem that we all have is that we're far too inclined, we're tempted away to other more exciting things all the time. It's far easier for us to see what's right in front of us and then rather sort of visualize what the future looks like. I wonder whether that's the case. All these people who only want they want one paragraph and then they move on. It's a slightly sort of schizophrenic sort of mode, way of consuming things. But I get, there's no great statistical significance in my research. I'm just weighing things up. But I mean, length aside, to go back to your question. The origin of the newsletter was firstly just experimentation and fun, because actually I'd started the whole project wanting to write, and then I sort of shifted inadvertently into doing pods. So I wanted to do some writing. Although when I do publish a pod, I tend to sort of probably overwrite a bit, kind of outlining what's going on and just some of my own thoughts, just because I sort of enjoy that. Although I suspect people may just jump to the pod. As I do when I listen to other people's pods. I don't often start reading the preparatory material before, but I think there's some sort of integrity and respect for the guest. And you do this as well. I know you put together always a handful of thoughtful paragraphs, which is sort of setting the context. But what I wanted to do then with the newsletter originally was to pick out a small number of provocative ideas, sometimes half-baked, things that had occurred to me during my reading in the previous week or two, or maybe some vignettes which preview or review my podcast and just give a bit more kind of flesh on the bones. And then also it was a sort of a community engagement piece, because as I mentioned to you before, I've opened the platform up now for guest contributions, and I've had a number of those over the last few months. So I'm keen to use it, to offer it up, if you like, to other people interested in the area, to write pieces for me. So it's all a bit of experimentation, but it's just really selfishly, it's about giving me an opportunity to write and scribble. And I also find, whether you find this, Christian, but particularly with writing, there's also the preparation for the pods, of course, but particularly the process of writing, it's slower, it's more thoughtful, it's more considered, at least it is for me. I can find myself, I can spend a whole day putting together, a 1,000 words. But, you really learn a lot from it, because if you do it properly, you review and you draft and you chisel and you improve it, you refine it, and you really kind of learn. You can learn a lot. You take yourself off in different directions. You go and read other articles. You really, it's very mind stretching.
I agree completely, and I find it really interesting when I can read transcripts of this show or listen to it. You actually realise how inarticulate we often are. We start sentences and then jump somewhere else, lots of umming, ahhing. And the written word, if you did that, you would sort of, people wouldn't bother reading it. It doesn't flow nicely. And spoken conversation, very, very different to the written word. And I think that for me has been a really fascinating piece, because that's not to say that the spoken isn't good communication, and it can be very effective. And you can actually say some very illiterate things that come. There's a certain former president of the US, right, for example, who, or even the current prime minister of the UK, who are not. If you literally wrote down what they said, it's rambling nonsense, but it seems to resonate with people on a human level. The written skill is very, very different, and you'll write one. I think the mouth allows one to. I'm going to mix metaphors now, but shoot from the hip. Whereas writing requires much more discipline and much more. So I think sort of one of them feels a bit like sort of. I'd say one is sort of hacking around in the undergrowth. The other one is sort of cultivating bonsai trees.
Exactly. And by the way, therefore, both of those disciplines are extremely pleasurable. There's something fun and relaxed about being able to have free-flowing audio conversations and being a little less worried about where it may take you. I also love the discipline of sculpting something and really talking of the political philosophy of less is more, in terms of, when there was the analysis of Trump's vocabulary saying, most of his speeches were made up of about 12 words or whatever it may be. And, Boris definitely stole something of that style with a small s. By the way, for those people listening who are interested in online writing, one of the guys that I read and listened to, which gave me a lot of good insight, is a guy called David Perel, which maybe we can add that into the show notes, because I think, I talk to friends who are interested in their own sort of subjects, whether it's sort of philately or whatever it may be, or cutlery collecting, or, all sorts of, the beauty of the internet is that there's a space for everyone, whatever you're interested in. And I think one of the challenges for any new writer or indeed any podcast maker, it's, as you say, it's finding the voice, but it's also overcoming this instinctive imposter syndrome. We question far too much what our real value is and what we have to add on a particular subject. Imposter syndrome, I think, is a reflection of intelligence and thought. And I think it's a positive reflection on sort of good quality right brain hemisphere self-doubt and introspection. Whereas I think those, e.g., responsible for financial crashes, as one sort of example, tend to be the sort of people who are very more sort of left brain, narrow beam focus, overconfident. I think a bit of self-doubt is good, but obviously too much holds one back from actually doing anything. So anyone who's interested in expressing their interest, I think, the answer is just you can have a go.
Yeah, and I think it's, as you say, it's quite extraordinary. And this comes back to, I think, how we view the world is whenever I take up a new hobby or I discover something new or something, and I'm diving into a rabbit hole, there are a ton of things oh my God, I didn't realize all of these things had gone in. And I'm fascinated as I explore what's going on, is that we're lucky in some respects that we have people that have dug into details for us. That allows our world to operate. I'm always straight, you go to the airport. I don't have to go, they wouldn't let me do this, but I don't have to go and check the aircraft's okay because someone's maintained it. I'll assume that someone's in the air traffic control tower keeping an eye on things. Somebody else has worked out exactly what size of plane they can put in the sky and how much fuel you need, all those sorts of things. Ditto, if I go to the supermarket, I'm not going to get poisoned. And so there are so many of these, and I think that applies to sort of things that we do, but there are also sort of interests and experiences, and I love diving into those. And I think, but back for me, part of the curiosity piece is asking questions and being able to dive into rabbit holes and find that there's people hanging out in those rabbit holes who do nothing but that. And that I find it tremendously, worrying in some cases when you see what some of those rabbit holes are, but equally joyful.
Very much so.
That we have this, there are people out there doing this, and there's somebody thinking about this topic and trying things. And it always makes me smile when I look at things like beer. There's some monks that have toiled away centuries ago, nothing else to do, but let's experiment, who've made themselves ill, who have, some of them will have died in the quest of making higher quality alcohol. And we've got that nowadays and can take it for granted. And I think all of this stuff points, and your whole curious approach, I think, points towards exactly those things, is sort of the human endeavor. It's marvelous when we think about it. Yeah,
I think, the mantra is, don't be boring, be interested in something. But you're right, it is joyful. The more niche the discovery of an interest is in someone, there is something particularly wonderful about, finding someone who is fascinated and also an expert on something that you know nothing about, and sort of escaping down those rabbit holes. It's one of the sort of the joys of meeting other people, and also the privilege that we have of having a platform of being able to invite these guests on. And when I think about the breadth of the guests that I have, and I think similarly you, I think that's the sort of the luxury that we have, that you sort of sit back and go, wow, anyone basically is accessible. I actually, funnily enough, for some bizarre reason, Barack Obama follows me on Twitter, but I'm not the only one by any means, although a few of my friends say, Obama follows you, and I'm very sort of chilled out about it. I don't want to say how it happened, but and of course, because he follows me, I don't want to talk about me and Barack, but of course, now that Barack follows me, I can DM him on Twitter. So of course I did invite him to the podcast, dear Mr. President, because that's the beauty of the internet. It's totally democratic. Of course, I can't divulge the dialogue that we've had since, but I've had to push him back.
Keep listening to the show.
Yeah, right? Keep listening to the show. We're talking ex-presidents to come, but I've got a backlog, so I've had to push him back.
He's gonna have to wait.
He will have to wait. I keep telling him, can you stop pestering me? It's infuriating.
Enough now.
Enough.
Right. But I'll tell you what I think is really funny is this sort of idea that if you were to get in touch with some of these people and just go, can I have an hour's worth of chat? You would get ignored. The sort of you or told to piss off or with right. If you say, would you like to appear on my podcast, which is the same thing, right? you get a magically different response in many cases. Not always by any stretch of the imagination. And I do find it funny the sort of, and I guess you must have this as well. There are people you approach that you think are going to be dead certain say yes, and they don't. And there's other people where you think, well, I'll give this a go, right? See what happens. And astonishingly, they say yes, and there's everything in between.
Absolutely. And by the way, most people are susceptible to flattery. So as you say, if you articulate the question in the right way, more often than not, people will respond. What sometimes holds one back is are the gatekeepers, of course. So where you're dealing with people's agents or PR people or whatever, then there always sort of tends to be can be a bit of a blocker. But yeah, look, I mean, it reminded me, Tim Ferriss wrote this book which propelled him, which it's not Lessons for Leaders, or it's a book basically in which he identified a bunch of people that he really kind of was into and interested in, big business names. He put together a list of, I think, his 11 favorite questions, which he'd refined and got advice on. And then he threw those questions at all these people he was interested in, saying, look, choose the 3 or 4 that you're most interested in and give me some answers. Put it into a book. And there you go. But I think his premise was, look, if you don't ask, you don't get. More often than not, if you say that you're writing a book or you're doing a podcast series and you just absolutely love to have your thoughts on it, people tend to be reasonably kind more often than not.
So we've talked about what's happening at the moment. Where do you go from here? And I recognise, given what we've talked about, that's a slightly silly question on the basis you won't fully know. But what's your current sort of thinking?
I'll just dig out my strategy document and just bear with me 1 second.
Pull it out of the bin, because that's probably where it's been sitting.
There it is. I mean, my strategy is finding the time to keep doing guys. It takes up. It's an enormous pleasure. I'm just sort of I'm ferreting around trying to find interest. I mean, for example, I'll give you a few people on my short list. I mean, this is not a strategy, but someone who I'm quite keen on interviewing is Alistair Campbell, actually. I was never sort of a huge fan of his when he was at the political heart of things, but I do.
So this was Tony Blair's
spin doctor in chief. Right. I think he talks a lot of sense. He sort of stands up against political bullshit, certainly against Boris Johnson right now. And I'm quite interested in sort of social sort of psychology around politics. I've done a couple of interviews on that subject. I interviewed Times journalist Danny Finkelstein, who is, again, not a professional, but I mean is a very high quality amateur social psychologist. And I want to do more of this, but I mean we talked about you talk about questions of power and influence and ambition and what it means having skin in the game in the political decisions that you make. How we understand things like the status quo bias in terms of how you make policy as a politician, which is to say that most of us, as in voters, punters, rather like the way things are. We don't like too much kind of radical change. In other words, it goes back to that point about certainty. We prefer less change. And so actually the fewer radical programs that are put forward by politicians is kind of better, all despite that a lot of politicians think they need to make their name by coming up with kind of radical ideas. It's those sorts of questions, understanding how polling and voting works, that old, I think, apocryphal David Ogilvy quotation, people don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, they don't do what they say, and so on. So it's those sorts of questions. I'm quite keen to do a bit more on politics. I'm quite keen to do a bit more on sport. I've got a short list of people on the sporting fraternity who I've got lined up. And then actually what I enjoy, and this is not an excuse for sort of having no precise strategy, but as you all know, one of the great ways of building one's guest list is you ask the last person you talk to for a referral. And that's the sort of the great fun of it, because you just sort of don't know what's going to come next. And if that's perhaps an excuse for saying I don't know what I'm doing, then but
I think that's entirely in keeping with what we talked about, curiosity. And so I think if you were to sort of chart a particular course, you would miss opportunities. And I sometimes find myself reading something and it just sort of sparks, and I've got to try and get them on, because that's just interesting. Yeah. And let's see and it may be something that maybe a return to a theme I've tackled before. It may be something that's completely left field, but for some reason it's got me. And how do you make the show different? Well, the answer is you make it authentic to yourself and don't necessarily follow a game plan, because that's replicable by other people.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a balance to it. I mean, you touched on this about kind of crossover learning. I mean, I also have this fascination of trying to connect the dots across different industries or different scientific disciplines, which in the end is all about trying to enhance our understanding of ourselves. Actually, there's a writer you may or may not have heard of, who I've become quite fascinated with lately. I think about the subject of connecting the dots and understanding ourselves, a guy called Dr. Ian McGilchrist. who writes amazingly about understanding ourselves and our existence and our point. He's a polymath of the greatest intelligence, philosopher, psychiatrist, writer. He wrote a book about 10 or so years ago called The Master and His Emissary, which is an allegory for the way in which the different brain hemispheres function. The master referring to the right hemisphere referring to the left. He wrote then a book in November last year published called The Matter with Things, which is about the length of the Bible. And what that's trying to is building on the master and his emissary, but it's trying to get to the heart of our existence and its meaning. Very heavy going topics. But he sets up this argument, and I'm just giving a little promo for him if people are interested in, because actually what I found interesting as a side note is that outside of the kind of the BS theories and the principles, starting to read around how the brain actually works contributes hugely to one's understanding of all this stuff. And so what McGilchrist is talking about in The Matter with Things is when he's talking about the contributions and the interactions between our two brain hemispheres at the start. So in simple terms, what he's saying is that the left brain hemisphere is very mechanistic. It's black or white in understanding. It's very dogmatic, very narrow beam focus. And if you're thinking in evolutionary language, you'd be talking about its purpose around being for grasping and manipulating things, about hunting your prey. Whereas basically the right brain is more about understanding context, nuance, subtlety, color. So whereas the left is more monochrome, the right is more multicolor. I mean, I think you touched this earlier on when we were talking about sort of AI and data obsession and that kind of balance between that and creativity and imagination. But what McGilchrist is trying to sort of counter is that our world today is far too dominated by this sort of blunt, abstracted left brain thinking, and that there are very few voices left in the world, and this is perhaps an exaggeration, but few voices left in the world which are reasonable, which are not consumed with rage and hatred, and rather we tend to take things out of context, which have understanding only in a very reductionist, abstracted way. This goes back to this point about obsession with machines, abstraction, decontextualization, disembodiment, whereas actually we need this mixture of science, imagination, creativity, and reason for our long-term survival. Anyway, some very big thoughts as we kind of.
No, I love that. It reminds me. I read somewhere somebody said, "Look, we'll need science to get us through this, i.e., the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we'll need the arts and culture to make it worth living afterwards."
Absolutely. It's the balance. I mean, the idea that you have sort of philosophers on one side and scientists on the other arguing with each other doesn't make any sense. You need it all in the pot.
Beautiful way to round us up. So just tell people, again, links to all of this stuff in the show. These show notes are going to be massive this time around, which is a big compliment to you and where you've taken us. But tell people, Daniel, where they can find the show and remind them what it's called in the newsletter.
Right. So get a pen, everyone. Get ready. Write this down. So a number of ways that you can find the pod archives, all the latest episodes, and indeed my articles. If you go to aloadofbs.substack.com, you can subscribe there. You can, of course, also search for A Load of BS in Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I've said that before. And of course, do subscribe, follow, leave me well, you can leave me a four-star review, I'll take, but 5 is even better. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel S.J. Ross. And I think that's fair enough. I think that'll give you a chance. That's
giving people more than enough.
More than enough. There we go.
Well, look, I knew this was going to be a fascinating. I had no clue where we were going to end up. We ended up in some spaces I thought we would, and some spaces I absolutely didn't, which is the whole joy of one, talking to you, and secondly, listening to your output. So I want to say, on behalf of as a listener and fan of yours, I want to say thank you for the work that you do, because I know how much effort goes into these things. And I love, somebody once said to me, there's someone rivaling your point. In fact, let's name them. Gerald Ashley said to me, he said, there's a rival for your podcasting. I didn't quite say crown, but he sort of implied it. And I take the opposite view. My view is, if there's high quality people out there, a rising tide lifts all boats. And your boat is absolutely one that I want to keep lifting. So thank you for what you're doing. Keeps people like me on my toes as well, because I sort of watch what you do with interest, curiosity, and a huge amount of personal benefit from it. So thank you for that. Thank you for being an amazing guest. And thank you as ever for just being a supreme pleasure to talk to.
Oh, Christian, thank you. And let me say also, by the way, back to Gerald, of course, Gerald has just started his own podcast, which we'll give a little nudge to with Mark Ross. I think we also both know, talking politics, current affairs, and all sorts of other bits and pieces. So do tune into that. And I need to say, I love listening to your stuff as well. So thank you for inviting me. It has been a huge pleasure, and what a wonderful way to start the week.
So we've broken all the podcasting rules here by basically inviting fellow podcasters onto each other's shows and doing this. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it for this special episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Daniel for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about A Load of BS, the podcast and the newsletter, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients to help them mitigate theirs, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, avoid the wrong kind of BS, and thanks for listening.